Hi everyone. This week we are going to get into some more detail about interviews and observations. And we'll also touch on document review. You have two articles assigned for reading this week. Both are about shifting from a clinical approach to interviewing and observation to a more research approach. So data collection, just to review, the primary approaches for data collection in qualitative studies are interviewing, observation, and document review. And the best approach is based on what you're trying to learn and what the research question is. And as we touched on last week, very important also, in addition to choosing your data collection approach, is to choose a purposeful sample. It is not probabilistic like it is in quantitative research. So you're often seeking out information-rich cases, cases that will give you a lot of information about what your research question is. And there are a number of different types. You can still have inclusion and exclusion criteria to really define your population of interest. And again, sample size is variable, but we don't, again, have probabilistic sampling. So we're not doing power analysis or anything like that. The size depends on a multitude of factors, but often we talk about data saturation, which we'll talk a little bit more about when we talk about analysis in a few weeks. So let's start with interviews. The reasons we would do a qualitative interview are often that a behavior of interest cannot be observed. So we need to ask people about it. We want to know how people feel. We want to understand how they interpret their world and understand their experience. And in one of my reference texts, they say the decision to use interviewing as the primary mode of data collection should be based on the kind of information needed and whether interviewing is the best way to get it. So again, pairing the approach with the research question. And qualitative interviewing, again, is really to learn about how people talk about their experiences, what they feel and perceive. We typically ask mostly open-ended questions because we want to understand how people experience the world in their own terms. So there is a continuum of structure in qualitative interviews. They can be highly structured, where the wording of each question is predetermined and must be presented in the same way with each person. This could be like a written survey with open-ended questions, or done orally. Sometimes it's used to obtain demographic information in qualitative studies. The kind of interview we most often see in, or at least that we're going to do in this class, is a semi-structured interview. And that is an interview where there's a guide, there is a set of questions that we start with, but there's some flexibility. Sometimes you can go out of order. The wording doesn't have to be exact if you ask it a slightly different way. And there's also space to have follow-up questions and continue on the same topic if that seems appropriate. Unstructured interviews are also used in qualitative studies. Often they are exploratory. They're often used in like an ethnographic type study where the researcher is embedded in their environment of study, and they may ask informal questions of other people in the vicinity. And sometimes these are appropriate when the researcher doesn't really know enough to know what to ask. Now, you've all done, because you're all clinically trained, you've all done clinical interviews. And when we're doing a clinical interview, we are looking for patterns in what people tell us about, so we can understand their diagnosis and therefore develop a treatment plan. It's situated in a therapeutic relationship. So if someone comes to see you for an evaluation, you're also setting, in addition to gleaning information about their condition, you also are setting the stage for a therapeutic relationship. And really, you are going to provide health care to the patient. So that is the purpose of this relationship. In a research interview, your goal ultimately is to get data and develop patterns from it. It's associated with a study, not with a clinical problem necessarily. And it's actually the balance of power is actually reversed because the participant is the one helping you as the interviewer to learn. Now, if you want to have good data, you need to have good questions. Patton describes 6 types of questions. You can ask questions about experiences and behaviors. You might ask about opinions and values. You could ask about how they feel about something, their kind of knowledge, what they already know or what they would like to know. Sensory information, how they've experienced sights, sounds, tactile sensations, perhaps. And sometimes it's relevant to ask about background or demographic type questions. There are some other categories of questions that may be appropriate depending on your interview topic. Sometimes we would ask a hypothetical question. So like, you might start with imagine a certain scenario and then ask them to respond. You can have a devil's advocate question where you present a contrarian point of view and ask them to respond to that. You could ask about the ideal position, so kind of the opposite of devil's advocate, like in a perfect world, which is kind of like a hypothetical as well, and interpretive questions. So asking people to interpret some piece of information or some perspective. So when you're developing questions, we want most of our questions to be open-ended. So a good approach would be something like, tell me about a time when you experienced X, or give me an example of Y. What was it like for you to experience Z? Where you're not really giving them any preconceived ideas about what they should say. Something to avoid. One is asking multiple questions. So if you said, how did you do this and what was it like for you and how did you feel? All in a row without giving them space to respond in between. That's an example of a multiple question. A leading question might start out with, don't you think X? So you're kind of suggesting what their answer should be. And of course, simple yes/no questions, in most cases in qualitative research, are not appropriate because they can just give a one-word answer, and that's not the kind of information you're typically looking for. In addition to our open-ended questions, we can also ask follow-up questions. So these may not be in your interview guide, but if somebody says something that seems really important, you might want to just ask for more detail. It can be just to clarify your understanding, which is often a very useful thing because sometimes we don't always get it right the first time in our own understanding. So clarifying anything you maybe are not sure about. And also, there are other approaches to kind of getting people to say more. Sometimes just sitting in silence is, just leaving a little bit of a pause gives people more space to speak. You may just make a sound like, Again, allowing a little bit of a pause for them to say more. You may just say a word like, oh, really? Again, always an invitation for them to add on. And sometimes you may just directly ask people to say a little bit more about the thing that's caught your attention. So switching gears to observations, there's a lot of different ways observations can be incorporated into qualitative studies. You may be observing a physical setting, you may be observing people, you may focus on particular activities or interactions, you may look at conversational exchanges, you may be sort of self-observing your own behavior in a particular context, and subtle factors is you might be kind of seeking out symbolic meanings or nonverbal communication, or perhaps even paying attention to what's not happening. So as a researcher in a research environment, we may have different roles. And these aren't hard categories, but more of a continuum. Sometimes you're completely immersed in whatever you're observing. You might be a full participant. And in other cases, you may be a complete observer. So if you think about if you've ever been in a classroom setting and maybe somebody came in to evaluate the classroom or the instructor's performance, but they just kind of sit in the back and don't say anything, and they would be a complete observer. And then in the same scenario, if a student who's a member of that class is rating their instructor, they're a complete participant, right? Because they're part of what's ongoing. And then there's some subtleties in between along that continuum. And some of it depends on how how aware the rest of the group is of your role as a researcher or observer. Recording observations can be challenging. Often we do a lot of field notes, and they can just be handwritten, but the field notes are intended to be highly descriptive, as detailed as possible, and also reflective, again, of the researcher's role in the scenario that's being observed. It can be very challenging to do the note-taking, though, while the observation is in progress. So generally it's recommended that researchers write up their field notes immediately as soon as the observation is concluded before they do anything else. Video recording is a possibility in some circumstances, but it's not always appropriate. For example, if you're in a public space, it may not be appropriate, or also in like a private clinical encounter, it may or may not be appropriate. So it's sometimes an option, but not the one we always want to count on. And again, it's always imperative to do those field notes whether or not there's a recording. Sometimes there are some studies now that observe online environments, so that is a kind of a newer venue of observation. And then similarly to interviewing, observations with a research lens versus a clinical lens are just different. Again, when you're observing a patient, you're observing for a different purpose than you are for a research study. And also in a research situation, you're often a little bit more vulnerable because you're kind of being allowed to participate in the scenario. It's somewhere that you may or may not often be on independently outside of a research context, as in an ethnographic study. Lawler talks about being present and the social boundary differences that are different in the research and clinical worlds. And then again, the reflexivity, that reflective component on the role of the clinician versus the transactional nature of research, where you're really there to learn and not to provide a service. I do want to touch briefly on using documents and artifacts for research, even though this is not heavily emphasized in your textbook, but I think it's just important to point out. There are many kinds of documents and artifacts that can be used. A lot of times public records are important to research, media, personal communications and documents like diaries or photo albums. Visual documents such as film and television and other media, physical objects. Physical trace material is the idea that the physical setting is changed because people have done some activity. And then sometimes some documents can be generated by researchers, which is more common in a participatory action research approach, although I've actually participated in a document review study from a randomized control trial where we reviewed treatment notes. Using documents and artifacts, it's really just important to have the connection that you have the right materials available to answer the research question. And then sometimes the authenticity of materials needs to be questioned if you're using primary sources versus some other type of secondary source. There are limitations, of course, because the materials that are available may not always be useful for the research question. Sometimes it can be difficult to determine authenticity, especially I think with this newer world of online material. But the strengths are that it's often very accessible, and it's not, these documents are not affected by the research process as a person who's interacting with a researcher may be. And in some kinds of research questions, documents and artifacts will be the best source of data. Here are the references I cited this week, and look forward to hearing your questions, your topic of interest.